Great. So thanks for sticking with me this far. This is the second video in Unit 4, and right now we're going to talk about what's called the AWS JavaScript Sdk, and you can Google for that. And it's what's called JavaScript in the browser. It's a very, very important part of the development of the web development profession right now. Most of you have heard of PHP. Wonderful website. You've probably been here many times. You may be familiar with Java. Java, the most important part of Java is Java EE. And so let's go Java tutorial. And Java tutorial is sprawling. Oops. It's a fantastic resource because you can actually learn, and there's so many cool parts about Java. And let's just say that Java EE is got to be the most influential part of Java. And now I'm going to fall upon it in a moment because you're able to code two sides. One is the client side, which is what the public sees. The other is the server side. And I think it's under here, if I understand. But what I'm going to say now is that PHP and Java are two of the most sought after sets of web development skills. They're very important. Eventually, they're going to have to contend with the fact that the Amazon people are running at a drastic portion of the cost. And it's drastically cheaper to run it your way. So you're actually going to be a little bit like South Korea, where you're going to skip the era of struggle, such as maybe if you could, compare nations. Let's say there's Britain, there's the United States. They've struggled with eras of industrialization, pollution, et cetera. Then there's nice, pretty little South Korea. And they said, well, guess what? We want to jump into the modern economy. We don't want to be like Japan, who has kind of done things the British and American way. We want to do it our way, but we want to say, well, if we could have the best of all possible worlds, and if we could be the United States right now, what would we want to aspire to? And so a lot of interesting things about South Korea is they said, well, instead of inventing the locomotive, let's just jump right into the future. And so when you go to these new emerging economies, such as South Korea, China, Brazil, they're kind of saying, well, there's no way that we can just be Great Britain and just start at the start. Let's just do the future right now. And that's why when you go to new places like Dubai or Hong Kong or Singapore, or they have the luxury of starting fresh. And that's kind of like you folks right now, where we could go through PHP, etc. We go through Java. These are great, great skills, but they're not going to arrive at the same degree of security, high availability, the same kind of stability as what you're going to do. And so the problem is you can only do this kind of development on Amazon right now. It's called serverless development. Now, other great cloud companies like Rackspace, it's just a matter of time before they allow you to create serverless web development. Rackspace is a great one. It's only just a matter of time before Azure, on Microsoft will allow you to do that. Right now, they don't. And it doesn't matter because not a lot of people use Azure. We love Azure in the IT room, but not .coms, not in the internet. It's just a matter of time before Google App Engine, supplies serverless. But right now, the one place in the world where you can get serverless app development, and you can do it on Google. Google is a wonderful company, but they don't have the cloud cred that Amazon does by a long shot. When it comes to the cloud, Amazon is like Tesla. When you think about electric cars, there are very few companies built upon the idea of electric cars, and there are very few companies that really chase the idea of electric cars quite like Tesla. Tesla and Amazon Web Services are alike in that regard. No one has chased the cloud like Amazon has. So nobody has the cloud that Amazon has. This is just another example of that. But what this means is that, and you should go through the getting started, and I'm going to link to this because it shows you how to set up your bucket. And you all need to walk through this. I've already walked through this basically, but you're going to get a little bit more. But what we're doing here is that instead of running a server-side component, we're just going to put JavaScript in a bucket, in a web page, and we're just going to run it, and we're going to touch the cloud from the client web page. So we're not going to do any server-side development. We're going to skip it. So there's no vulnerable, open, unpatched Linux, right? There's no Linux to manage. There's no PHP, emerging zero-day exploit PHP to be afraid of. Amazon is incredibly resilient, right? And they do not have a history of being hacked. It's a rewrite of the server protocol so that you have much more lower level integrity and security happening. So you're tapping into CIA grade security on your first call. That's good. You need that. You don't want jiggery third world security to have to live with. It's a very tough world, and it's scary to get hacked. So the JS SDK is a big deal. So I want you to go through the getting started. Also, we want to say that an important building block is Dynamodb. And so if I go into my AWS console, Dynamodb is right under database. Dynamodb is kind of the flagship database product that Amazon offers. It's different than the SQL databases that you have used before. SQL databases have a lot to do with disk, and they're very oriented with being installed on a machine. Now you can create what are called master-slave, where there are replications of that database that are created. You can also do what's called sharding a database, so that you take all the A records and you put them on this server, all the B records and put them on this server. But I don't envy the person, specifically the developer, who has to shard a MySQL database. Probably the greatest internet company that I'm aware of that has a sharded MySQL is Pinterest. And so, here's my Pinterest page. I'm not sure. Sometimes you got some really cool. These are like the trending. Oh yeah. Look at that. So you've got the trending posts in your domain. Pinterest is wonderful, and what the very hardworking engineering staff at Pinterest has done, and you should look at the Pinterest engineering blog just for inspiration when you want to see what a real San Francisco, Silicon Valley internet company is doing. They're constantly, hardening up their platform so they could do better e-commerce through Pinterest, better machine learning, better photographic analysis. So they recommend stuff based upon, photographs. They read the RGB profile. So they have a wonderful blog about how that is working. And you can see, evolving MySQL compression. They really do a lot with MySQL, to their credit. And they're one of these wonderful companies that operate in Silicon Valley where they're like, well, we just want to do everything ourselves. We want to have control over the infrastructure all the way down to the lowest block level of of every compute unit that we have. And, that's great. They're really a part of a family of corporations, Google being the parent, Facebook being the next, Twitter being the next, and as people move in and out of those corporations and get stock options to work elsewhere, they've spread that kind of expertise around to different Silicon Valley corporations. But let me say this: before Facebook IPO'd in 2012, they had taken on, by my count, at least $3.8 billion in investment. Now, some of it they used, some of it they just banked and allowed people to take up shares. But a lot of you are not going to have access to that capital. If you went to MIT, Stanford, or Harvard, you may be able to interview for that capital. But for the rest of the world, you're not. You probably aren't able to raise that kind of money. Does that make sense? And a lot of people raise money and nothing happens. Go to TechCrunch. TechCrunch is kind of the daily blog of companies that are financed. I believe it's down here. These are the latest funding. And you may not have heard of them. You may not be using them. And you may never see them. They may just get bought or moved around. And this is the wonder of Silicon Valley. But what I think matters is not whether you and I are making new Silicon Valley organizations. A lot of these news sources are really going nowhere. Does that make sense? Journalism does not have an obligation to morals. Journalism has the obligation to survive. So if they cause you to read that story, that's their job. Especially in this era. Journalists are not here to tell you what to think. They're here to get their own bills paid. It ain't an easy world. So there are plenty of great Silicon Valley corporations, but you should not care about that. You should care about making a corporation in Idaho. You should be able to make a corporation in Yucaipa, California. You should be able to make a corporation on your terms, not on other people's terms. And you should be able to make a website about what you think is interesting, what you believe should be considered. Because for every one of you, there's 20 million people who are just like you and would like to see the same thing. And it's not necessary for you to move up to the Bay Area to interview for $2 million for something that you can make in your dorm room. BernieNation.com being a good, the revolution goes on.us being a cool idea, or, for you all who are in that, you should use your preferences to generate new and innovative ideas while you're in college. Dream big by making sites. But back to Dynamodb. Dynamodb works on a different principle than MySQL. MySQL is now owned by .com. Yeah, is now owned by Oracle. Sun bought them, I believe, and now Oracle bought Sun, or for some reason the Matryoshka doll of this corporate stack. Now it's owned by Oracle, and MySQL is this. I was an Oracle DBA, so I learned MySQL just because I was a Linux head, and I knew MySQL was important, and it created good relationships with other important. I was in bioscience, and they do a lot with, MySQL there. It's open source and therefore interesting, to the eggheads. But let me say the premise of MySQL is that you have a disk and you put your database on it, and it creates a large file, and it's parsed in memory, and that you can do SQL or structure query language on it. And that's awesome. But when it comes to the cloud, making something that's disk dependent is not as interesting as something that is cloud dependent. And if you go ahead and you shard a large database, well, that's a whole lot of additional work. So what's interesting is that in the last few years, as a database person, it's been fun to watch all the database projects come about, especially on Apache, where there are literally just dozens of new cloud-friendly databases, one of which is CloudDB. And what's happening, with intuitive JSON API, what these cloud databases want to do is they want to liberate you from the disk. So instead of there being a SQL interface, it's going to be just about using the building blocks. Now, SQL is wonderful. SQL is like the Harley Indian of the internet. You cannot destroy it. Generations of programmers have coded different languages. SQL remains the same. And I think that many of these cloud databases will use SQL in the future. Right now, they're not. And the reason why is developers are willing to forego the SQL interface in favor of the immediate out-of-the-box scalability that they need in order to make new companies. So let me say this. Right now, and here's TechCrunch, fun website. If you're a developer, you're afraid of it because you're afraid that you'll learn about a competitor doing your stuff, so you read TechCrunch with fear. But you look at all these new brands that are getting funding, these are, 15 million, 12 million, whatever they're using. Each of them want to be the next Pinterest. But the question is, and many of these venture capital firms need to feel this, is, well, why would they do their own infrastructure? They should be as conservative with expenses as possible and go straight to Amazon Web Services and get the product out there in front of people and not spend 2 years or 4 years making a cloud when really 12 million won't go that far. $1 million, that's like 10 people. You know, everybody on that team needs to make 100 grand just to get rent in Silicon Valley. You know, so if you want to make that corporation in coastal California, you know, everybody's got to get 100 grand so they can work around the clock and pay their bills and have insurance. And so 10 million will pay for, you know, a couple people in a rental building. So, you know, you need to do things very, very intelligently, you know, very conservatively. Always hired, only gets 500K, you know. So these kind of NoSQL databases are the way that new companies are doing it. And we're going to say that because DynamoDB is a NoSQL database. It doesn't use structured query language. And when you first use DynamoDB, you get immediate scalability. It's like they have a lot of artificial intelligence behind the scenes that are helping to manage the database itself. So it scales very well. It replicates very well. It has very good redundancy. It has very good failover. And has very good indexing and sorting. So Dynamo is going to be an important element for us. So I have a couple tables here. I'm going to use main test today. A couple attributes that I've set up is that they have what's called a partition key and a sort key. Now, they don't have a primary key here. You can use a primary key if you wish, but it's more important that you have a partition. And what the database does is it automatically shards, or it breaks itself up alphabetically into little chapters where you get the A entries and the B entries and the C entries and the D entries based upon the partition key. And then you have a sort key, which is an additional attribute that helps you sort within the partition. So instead of focusing on the primary key, they're much more interested in breaking up the table into scalable partitions. You have what are called read and write capacity units, and you'll get 5 for free in your which means that you have the capacity to read and write 5 different operations at a time. So it's not enough to go live, but it's enough to develop and test. And that's for free. And you can make it within the data center, the region that you wish. So mine is very simple. The items, I just have a couple of items, my item ID and my sort key. And then as you add new rows, you can add an unlimited number of columns to each row. And that's very different from MySQL, where in MySQL you need to define the columns ahead of time, the database schema in your entity relationship diagram. And here, the cloud does not care how many columns or attributes you have. So it's a very interesting, it's built to scale from the get-go, and it's built to go cloud native from the get-go. There are dozens of little NoSQL databases that have been percolating over the last couple of years. Amazon has morph that tech into Dynamo, which is now their flagship. So if you wish to create a table, you can go through this and then add a partition key, add a sort key, and then you're going to create. So you can do that. Mine is called main test. So that's, now here's what also is interesting. When you get into your database, you have what are called access control. Access control is important. And you're going to go over to access control. And I'd love to shrink this page a little bit. Sorry, my Mac is much more, you have much more room on yours probably. And what you're going to do is you're going to use Facebook as your authentication tool. We'll learn that in a minute. It's easy. And then you're going to say, well, let's select all the possible privileges on this I could get. Now, batch get, batch write, you don't need to have that. But update, query, put, get, delete, you want those. And so you go create policy. Now, this is a policy that we're going to apply into the security system over here on IAM. And so I'll give you this is kind of like a cooking channel where I have some stuff that are prepared, you know, and what you're going to do is you're going to make roles, and you create a new role, and you'll do that here. And my role that I made is called Spring 2017 DynamoDB. And I made this policy, and I'll show you what the policy has. So what I did is I can edit this policy. And so what I did is I took all of my stuff here, and I copied it, and I pasted it into my policy document. Okay, and then what I did is I actually eliminated this condition. I didn't do that, and that's what helps it to work at this point. Sorry, it's scrolling over. I eliminated this right here, and I dropped that in there, and you can validate the policy. And this is a form of it reminds me of JSON a little bit. It's challenging. They allow you to edit so you won't make mistakes. You have bracketing, and then you have one statement, and then you validate it, so that it's valid JSON, I imagine. And then you can go ahead and save it. And they say it's valid. And you can say, I haven't changed it. So that policy is going to be applied to your role. And I call it do query on main test. And it allows me to delete an item and get an item, put an item, query item, update an item. All things that you're going to learn. You're going to learn the query piece today. Query is the big monster. You're going to do the hardest part first. And it'll be all downhill from here. Okay? So, what I recommend is just repeat, play the video again. Play the video like 5 times. Remember taking piano lessons? You might have done some memorization before you go into it. It's like playing piano as an 8-year-old or a 9-year-old. Maybe you didn't do that many lessons. It's fine. I didn't do that many. But I remember kind of having to memorize some stuff. So here I've got my role, and inside of that I got my policy, do query on main test, and I can add multiple policies. And you guys will add multiple policies as you do different operations, and you'll do photograph uploads and queries, etc. So you can see that policy directly connects with that Dynamodb access control. And the best thing, I learned how to ski. I became a good skier, but I remember the first week I was skiing. I learned traditional skiing growing up, but I learned telemark skiing, which is very out of style now. But it was very cool back in the 90s. I think the grunge 90s, we were all using cross-country skis to ski down hills. And it was very, very athletic but I had to fall on my face about 25 times before I really learned how to ski well. And I guess what I want to say to you all is please fall down 25 different times. Be like a skateboarder, that kid who's in the park, who's just wiping out. That kid is eventually going to become a very good skateboarder, and he or she knows it. And I want you to be that kid who's fearless and wiping out. So try stuff, it'll break, you get an error, walk back through it. Be that kind of resilient person. And naturally, we'll go over it 100 times here. So now you're putting a few things together. You've got your bucket, and your bucket has a CORS policy on it. And your CORS policy, I'm going to give you the code for that. That's going to be in this tutorial. You realize that's my CORS policy. You've also got a DynamoDB where you've got a table that has a partition and a sort key. It's got an access control so that when you put that access control statement, copy, paste that into IAM, you've got a role that contains a policy that allows you to do these operations on that DynamoDB table that you're using. And remember, guys, right now it's important to just have the conceptual landscape so that when it comes around to debugging stuff, you kind of know where the error comes from. Because errors come about, and etc. You need to know how to manage that. And we attach that policy that we made there. Now the remnant piece that we need to look at, I'm going to get there by going to developers.facebook.com. Most likely you don't have a developer account on Facebook. That's good. Most likely you do have a Facebook account. And so what I want you to do is I want you to register with developers.facebook.com. And I've done that maybe 2 or 3 years ago, so your process might be slightly different. I certainly don't want to destroy my account and then do it fresh. But what you do then is you have apps, and you can add a new app, easy, and yours is going to be a website. And let's say, and that's going to create, let's say, and I'm going to say that's inside of this category. Oh, sorry. I'm terrible at those, so hopefully I'll get it right. And then I now have a new site, and this is going to be some JavaScript that you're going to use in a few minutes in the next video. Your URL is going to be wherever it is in your S3. So you're going up there and you say, well, this is going to be the URL that I'm going to work with. I can probably copy that link and put it into my URL, and that's where and now that I have that in there, I can probably, the concept that I want to get across is that every app that's created on Facebook has what's called an app ID. And so when you're done, this is the app ID that you're going to use when you're going to begin to use your website. Now, Facebook offers some wonderful assets. And so I'm going to use a very advanced page here. This is where we're going to go by the end of, maybe the next couple lectures. And so I'm going to go to my example here. And the first thing I need to do is I need a login. Now, naturally, when we're doing development, we're going to do inspect element. And you can see that I'm already connected via Facebook. And what I did is I actually used Facebook to authenticate and prove my identity. And so instead of creating a registration component for your website, you're actually going to use Facebook as the username and password authentication. Now, the reason why that works for your site as it does for hundreds of thousands of other websites, Facebook has supplied a very interesting component of the internet, which is what's called OAuth. And it's a third-party authentication where basically you're going to supply, and here I'm looking for a quick. Basically, it's saying, thanks a lot, here's my password, and now here's a token that you're going to use that will prove that I am authenticated. So if your website trusts Facebook, and it will, and then Facebook supplies that token coming back, the token will get given back to Amazon Dynamodb, and then you will inherit all of these permissions on the database. And so architecturally, that's an important piece. So what you guys are doing is you're actually pulling two different clouds together. You're using the Facebook cloud as an authentication and security service, and then you're using Amazon with all of its built-in security layers, but as more of a content delivery platform who needs an OAuth protocol to work. Now, for those of you who've done some higher level networking classes, you're probably familiar with the idea of Kerberos and Kerberizing applications. Kerberos use what's called a ticket granting facility. And once you basically are authenticated through a Kerberos, you use that ticket to wander through the rest of the resources within a cloud. So after that token, your authentication token gets sent back to your browser, you're going to use that token to walk around the cloud. And so you've unlocked the security component for your website. So it's a big deal. You'll get used to it. So let me get back to this JavaScript tutorial. And after you get your Facebook app ID, you're going, and this is for, you're going to use that IAM role. And what's cool here is that your trust relationship is going to use Facebook from the get-go. And we'll show you how that works. And what's happened is that Amazon will trust traffic back and forth to your website because you're working with what's called assume role with web identity. So you can use Facebook's authentication mechanism as the username password to walk around your website, which is kind of big. Okay. Now, we've talked about a lot of components here, so I'm going to end this video just to keep it so it's not a 40-minute video. But now you have a couple of important things that you're putting together. Firstly, you've got your HTTP service, which is the bucket. That's your web server. Second, you've got a database, which is cloud friendly. And then you've got a partition key and you've got your sort key in the database. Third, you've got access control on that database so that you will give out limited permissions. You also have what's called an ARN, or an Amazon resource name, that we'll talk about in the next lecture. And then you're putting that into IAM. So IAM gives you the ability to receive OAuth tokens through Facebook's authentication system. So now you have a very, very state-of-the-art security architecture right before you begin development. So you guys are secure before you launch into a big production, which is the way that professional developers work right now. Technically, if you're securing a database down the line, you're kind of patching something that is fundamentally insecure. And there are ways of, if you're securing something later, there's ways to get at your system. You kind of have to start with something that's secure in its JSON before you move forward. So that's what you guys are doing. So, congratulations on getting this far. All right, we'll get to the next video in a minute.